The message was not meant to be saved. It arrived folded once, slid between other documents and removed within hours. No copies. No official record. Just a brief acknowledgment from someone whose job was not to acknowledge anything at all. That is where this story really begins. Princess Diana's public life was meticulously archived. Every handshake, every smile, every dress. But her private life, the one shaped by fear, affection, leverage, and silence, was managed differently. Carefully. Selectively. Often erased. By the early 1990s, Diana no longer lived as a wife, but she had not yet been allowed to exist as a free woman. This limbo defined everything. Who she could see. Who she could trust. Who could touch her without it becoming a constitutional issue. Romantic relationships, in her case, were not simply personal choices. They were risks. Each one evaluated not by emotion but by optics, loyalty, and containment. She learned this early. Calls were logged. Visits noted. Movements observed even when no one admitted it. Some men were discouraged quietly. Others were tolerated until they became inconvenient. A few were allowed but only under conditions never written down. Diana understood the rules. And she learned how to bend them. She used side entrances. Changed routes without notice. Chose companions not for status but for discretion. She was drawn to people who existed outside the royal ecosystem, men who did not belong to court circles, who did not speak in protocol, who could leave without consequences. But even intimacy came with surveillance. Former protection officers described nights when Diana would wait before speaking. Long pauses. Listening. Making sure the room was empty not just physically but electronically. She assumed phones were monitored. Sometimes they were. Sometimes they weren't. The uncertainty was the point. This shaped her relationships. Affection became fragmented. Conversations rushed. Meetings compressed into stolen hours. Emotional honesty traded for plausible deniability. Love, when it appeared, was forced to exist under pressure, and pressure distorts everything. Publicly, Diana was described as needy. Emotionally dependent. Difficult. Privately, the reality was more controlled and more dangerous. She was learning how power worked when you didn't officially have any. She kept track of who leaked information and who didn't. She noticed patterns in press coverage that suggested coordination. She understood that certain stories appeared only after specific meetings. And she adjusted. Sometimes she would deliberately allow one version of herself to be seen, while protecting another completely. Vulnerability, when performed correctly, could disarm. Sympathy could be weaponized. Silence could force negotiations. This was not manipulation for its own sake. It was survival. The strain showed in private habits. Irregular sleep. Eating patterns that mirrored control, slipping and returning. Long nights spent rereading old letters, not for nostalgia but to assess loyalty. To see who had changed tone. Who had grown colder. Relationships were not just emotional connections. They were liabilities. And Diana knew that love, for her, would always be used against her. By the time certain friendships deepened into something more intimate, she had already learned the cost. The phone calls that followed. The subtle warnings. The way protection arrangements shifted without explanation. Someone was always reminding her where the boundaries were. But boundaries invite testing. One relationship in particular changed how she behaved afterward. Not because it ended but because of how quickly information moved once it existed. How private moments became known to people who should never have known. After that, Diana stopped trusting proximity. She trusted patterns instead. Who spoke to whom? Who stopped calling? Who suddenly became polite? Behind the public narrative of romance and heartbreak was something colder. A woman mapping an invisible structure of control around her life. And then quietly she began to resist it. Not loudly. Not recklessly. Administratively. Schedules altered. Meetings shortened. Certain conversations moved off palace grounds. Names removed from approved access lists. A kind of soft rebellion that looked harmless until it wasn't. The note I mentioned earlier appeared during this phase. It didn't express fear. It expressed awareness. It suggested that Diana knew more than she was supposed to. About how information traveled. About who benefited from certain stories. About how quickly protection could turn into containment. After that note circulated privately, several things changed. Some doors opened faster. Others closed completely. And the nights became louder with more calls, more tension, more urgency. Diana was no longer just reacting to her life. She was actively negotiating it. And somewhere between affection and exposure, between freedom and consequence, she reached a point where every decision carried weight, not just for her reputation but for her safety. That is where we stop for now. Because the next phase of her private life is not about love or loss or fairy tales. It's about what happens when someone famous realizes they are no longer just being watched, but managed. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you like this story. The shift was subtle at first. Not something that would make headlines or even concern most of the people around her. It appeared in the margins of daily life. In the way Diana began to separate people into categories that had nothing to do with rank or title. Those who listened. Those who reported. Those who asked too many questions under the pretense of care. Her private rooms became smaller, not physically but functionally. Fewer chairs. Fewer reasons for anyone to linger. Lamps repositioned to avoid reflections in darkened windows. The television almost always on, even when muted not for entertainment, but to mask the sound of conversation. At night she rarely stayed still. She moved from room to room as if testing where silence felt safest. A habit that protection officers noticed but never commented on. Notes were made. Everything was always noted. Relationships during this period became more complicated, not because of emotion but because of logistics. Where to meet. How long to stay. Which phone to use and for how many minutes. Diana had learned that intimacy in her world was measured in exposure time. The longer a connection existed, the more visible it became. And visibility for her was dangerous. There were men she cared for deeply. That much is clear from private correspondence. But affection was always interrupted by consequence. A call that arrived too soon after a meeting. A journalist asking a question that revealed knowledge no outsider should have had. A sudden change in security protocols that quietly discouraged further contact. This is where many narratives simplify her life into romance and heartbreak. That framing misses the reality. What Diana experienced was not just emotional loss. It was behavioral conditioning. Every personal decision triggered a response. And she began to study those responses carefully. She noticed that some stories appeared in the press without names attached, written in a tone that felt rehearsed rather than curious. She noticed how certain individuals suddenly became unavailable after private conversations. She noticed how sympathy could be offered publicly while pressure was applied privately. And she adjusted again. She became more selective with vulnerability, more deliberate with affection. She learned that crying in public bought time. That silence created discomfort. That refusing to explain herself forced others to reveal their intentions first. This was not instability. It was adaptation. Her eating patterns, often discussed as pathology, followed the same logic. Control taken back in small, measurable ways. When everything else, movement, relationships, reputation, was subject to approval, the body became one of the few territories left untouched by protocol. Doctors focused on symptoms. Diana focused on agency. Some nights she wrote letters she never sent. Not emotional confessions but analytical breakdowns of recent interactions. Who had spoken out of turn? Who had avoided eye contact? Who had changed tone mid-sentence? These were not diaries. They were records. One former aide described finding her awake before dawn, sitting on the floor, papers spread out like evidence. Not crying. Not panicking. Thinking. There was an increasing awareness that she existed in two timelines simultaneously. The public one where she was expected to heal, smile, and represent compassion. And the private one, where she was learning exactly how little protection compassion offered. Her relationships suffered because of this split. Partners wanted reassurance. She needed discretion. They wanted permanence. She needed exits. Love, for Diana, became something that had to be planned around risk assessments. At a certain point, she began to speak more openly but only to a very small circle. Conversations grew more direct. Less emotional. She asked questions about procedures. About contingencies. About what would happen if certain lines were crossed. These were not the questions of someone afraid of life. They were the questions of someone trying to understand the limits of it. The nights grew heavier. Calls stretched longer. Voices lowered. Decisions delayed then made suddenly. She was no longer simply reacting to pressure, she was anticipating it. Preparing for outcomes that no one else seemed willing to discuss openly. And beneath it all ran a quiet, persistent realization that being loved by millions did not equate to being protected by anyone. The machinery around her continued to function smoothly. Events, charities, appearances, smiles perfectly timed for the camera. But behind the scenes, the margin for error was disappearing. Something was approaching. Not a single moment but a convergence. Of attention. Of expectations. Of unresolved tensions. Diana sensed it. Not as panic but as compression. The feeling that choices were narrowing. That time, which once felt abundant, was becoming structured and unforgiving. She did not say this out loud. She didn't need to. The way she began to organize her life said enough. By the time autumn settled in, Diana's life had begun to feel compressed, as if the walls around her were moving inward without anyone admitting they were doing the pushing. Her days were still full. Public engagements stacked neatly on briefing sheets. Charity visits planned down to the minute. The familiar choreography of cameras, smiles, hands reaching out. To the outside world, nothing appeared unusual. If anything, she seemed calmer. More composed. Less reactive. That was the illusion. Privately, her life had become an exercise in constant calculation. Not paranoia precision. She learned to read the temperature of a room before speaking. To note who stood closer than necessary. To sense when a conversation was being steered rather than shared. She trusted fewer people now but trusted them more deliberately. There were evenings when she would return from an event and sit without changing clothes, still wearing the face the public recognized, letting it fall away only after the door was locked. Staff learned not to interrupt those hours. If she needed something, she would call. If she didn't, silence was expected. Silence, for Diana, had become a form of protection. Her personal relationships existed in fragments. Short meetings. Conversations broken into manageable pieces. She avoided patterns that could be mapped. Avoided predictability. Not because she wanted secrecy for its own sake, but because predictability had consequences. People around her noticed the shift. Some interpreted it as distance. Others as confidence. A few understood it as something else entirely. There were discussions she initiated quietly about independence, about future roles, about what it would mean to exist without constant supervision. These were not dramatic confrontations. They were calm, measured inquiries. Hypothetical questions asked in a neutral tone. But hypotheticals in her position were never just hypotheticals. She had learned how quickly curiosity could be reframed as instability. How concern could become control. So she asked carefully. She listened more than she spoke. She let others explain their assumptions out loud. And in doing so, she began to understand the structure she was inside. Protection officers rotated more frequently. Advisors appeared, then disappeared. Messages passed through intermediaries who claimed to be helping while narrowing her options. Nothing overt. Nothing illegal. Just enough pressure to remind her where the limits were. At night, the phone rang often. Sometimes it was reassurance. Sometimes warnings disguised as advice. Sometimes people checking in to see what she knew or what she might do next. Diana rarely revealed much. She asked questions instead. Let pauses stretch. Let the other person fill the silence. This made some people uneasy. Her private notes from this period become more strategic. Less emotional language. More timelines. She began grouping events not by importance but by reaction. What followed what? Who benefited? Who lost access? She was tracing cause and effect in a system designed to obscure both. The public narrative continued to focus on her personal life, on romance, on loneliness, on recovery. That narrative was convenient. It kept attention away from the quieter transformation happening behind closed doors. Diana was no longer simply enduring her circumstances. She was learning how to navigate them without permission. There were moments of doubt, certainly. She missed simplicity. Missed conversations that didn't require forethought. Missed the idea of being unobserved. But those moments passed quickly. She could not afford indulgence. The stakes felt higher now. Not in a dramatic sense. In a procedural one. Every decision triggered a response. Every change rippled outward. And she could feel the system adjusting, recalibrating, trying to regain equilibrium. She didn't know where it would lead. She only knew she was no longer willing to drift. By the time winter approached, her schedule had tightened again. Fewer public appearances. More private meetings. Travel plans revised at the last moment. Small, quiet assertions of control. Nothing that could be pointed to. Everything that could be felt. Those close to her sensed a growing urgency, though she rarely spoke of it directly. She seemed focused, alert, intent on something just beyond the immediate horizon. As if she understood that the next set of choices, ordinary on the surface, would determine how much room she had left to move. And somewhere in the background, beyond the headlines and the carefully maintained image, the pressure continued to build. Not toward an ending, but toward a moment where the balance would shift again one way or another. By the final months, the rhythm of Diana's life had slowed in ways that felt intentional rather than imposed. She still appeared in public, still moved through crowds with that familiar ease that cameras loved. But those moments had begun to feel like controlled exposures, carefully chosen, carefully timed. She was no longer everywhere. She was selective. Absence, she had learned, carried its own kind of authority. Behind closed doors, the atmosphere was quieter, almost austere. Fewer late-night calls. Fewer explanations offered. Decisions were made earlier in the day now, as if she preferred not to leave important matters to the hours when doubt could grow unchecked. Her notes became shorter, more decisive. Where earlier pages had questions, the later ones had conclusions. She spoke less about emotions and more about outcomes. Those close to her describe a woman who seemed lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because she was no longer negotiating every feeling aloud. Heavier because the responsibility for her own direction now rested squarely on her shoulders. There was no illusion left that anyone else would manage it for her. Relationships, too, reached a kind of clarity. Not resolution clarity. She accepted what could not be protected, what could not be kept private, what would always come with cost. Affection remained, but it no longer governed her choices. She had learned that love, in her position, could be sincere and still be destabilizing. What mattered now was autonomy. There were conversations in these final months that sounded almost mundane to anyone listening in. Discussions about schedules. About travel routes. About future projects and where they might realistically take place. But beneath that practical tone was something more significant. A woman positioning herself carefully within the limits she finally understood. She was not reckless. She was deliberate. The public, meanwhile, remained focused on the surface. On speculation. On images frozen in time. The deeper shift, the internal reorganization of her life, went largely unnoticed. And perhaps that was the point. Diana had learned that visibility was never neutral. That attention could be both currency and constraint. And she had begun, quietly, to decide how much of herself she would continue to spend. Those who spoke with her near the end recall a steadiness that hadn't been there before. Not happiness in the simple sense. Something firmer. Acceptance mixed with resolve. She seemed aware that her life would always be interpreted, always reframed by others, but she was less interested now in correcting the record. She knew how little control that offered. Instead, she focused on what she could shape: her time, her priorities, her boundaries. Small decisions taken seriously. The kind that don't announce themselves but accumulate. There were no dramatic declarations. No final confrontations. Just a series of quiet choices that, taken together, suggested a woman no longer willing to be carried by circumstance. And that is where this story ends, not with a moment the world already knows, but with one it largely missed. A period in which Princess Diana was not simply reacting to fame, pressure, or expectation, but actively redefining how she would live within them. A life still constrained, still observed, but no longer entirely directed by forces outside herself. The headlines would continue. The images would endure. But beneath them was a private reality shaped by nights of thought, by closed rooms, by decisions made without applause. A reality far more complex than the symbol she became and far more human than the story history often prefers to tell. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you like this story /.